Okay, to the big debate this evening. Walmart's disclosure that it spent around $25 million as lobbying fee for India access has snowballed into a major controversy. The Lok Sabha was adjourned for the second day in a row after opposition parties insisted on a probe. Even the Congress admits that the issue merits a detailed check, and that raises the big question: should India also legalize lobbying just like the US? We have with us two very special guests joining us on Business Tonight this evening. Dilip Cherian of Perfect Relations and Mohandas Pai, former board member at Infosys and chairman of the Manipal Universal Learning. Dilip Cherian, to you first. We just heard the CII president Adi Godrej say that he doesn't like the word lobbying. He'd rather prefer using the word advocacy. My question to you tonight: what's wrong with the word lobbying? Why is it a dirty word?
I don't think there's anything wrong with the word lobbying. The only problem is that our very learned legislators seem to want to create a whole sort of slew of issues around it, and I think that this is because, not because they don't understand it, because I assume they do, but I suspect because there is political reason to create this hailstorm. You know, one is of course a business of having lost a vote in the House, but I think the big issue is that people recognize that this is something that they can make noise about with impunity. Because if you look at lobbying and if you look at the issue that's being raised, the real matter that is being discussed today is, are bribes being paid? So it's almost as if the legislators are accusing themselves. It's a question of mea culpa. So it's not whether it's called advocacy or whether you call it some other polite term, policy think tank or interest groups or trade unions, meaning everybody wants to give it a name and then hang the same cat. The fact is that legislators are talking about corruption, and corruption is indeed a big issue, but lobbying need not be identified with that. That's my problem.
Right. Dilip, don't you realize that somewhere India needs to make a distinction between what is lobbying and what is perhaps an undue favor received by giving graft? And perhaps that line is very, very blurred and perhaps misunderstood in India. Is that a point that you're trying to make here?
Look at the two markets where lobbying is regulated well. The European Union in Brussels and in America. And in both places, what actually starts is with legislators being willing to be accounted for in terms of who they met, what they discussed, and what the transaction was, and whether any electoral donations were made to them as a result of this exercise of lobbying. Now, so understand where this actually begins. It needs to begin with transparency first in the decision-making process, and it needs to go on to legislators being willing to legislate for themselves a kind of set of rules which ensures a complete transparency into who they are, what the interests that were represented to them are, and what, if any, financial transaction was involved. Now, unless it begins there, all of this conversation, all of this debate, and all the fire and brimstone in Parliament is going to be a whole lot of fury, signifying very little.
Right. I have more to ask you on the transparency bit and whether legalizing lobby will perhaps make the system more transparent. But Mohandas Pai, to you, is lobbying a misunderstood term in India? Because we cannot deny it is a part of doing business here.
Yes, lobbying is a business reality. Business leaders go to the government and talk to them about what needs to be done. The CII, FICCI and other bodies also lobby on part of industry. And there's nothing wrong about lobbying for good policies. I think we should all lobby for good policies because we need very complex policies. The needs of this economy are very, very different today from what it was when we are an agrarian economy. So I think lobbying is happening in this country. But what we are talking about is the American system of professional lobbyists. Now, Radia had a very bad impact on the public perception because that is the wrong kind of lobbying. It's not a lobbying based upon knowledge. It's a lobbying based upon doing favors, and I think that's totally wrong. But what you need today is professional lobbying, which is done on the basis of information, on the basis of transparency. So we need to create a culture where we register lobbyists and they work under a certain regulatory mechanism.
Okay, what you're saying is what you need today is professional lobbying. But Mohandas, at the end of the day, at one level, lobbying does mean asking for undue favors. It does mean trying to influence the policy framework that's at play. How does one draw the line here? How does one, try and make policy makers understand their point of view without, in a sense, seeking an undue favor?
I think lobbying is making policymakers understand your point of view. Please remember, policymakers and legislators meet many people. There is a lot of clutter in the air. They're not able to concentrate on what needs to be done. So if you want your voice to be heard, you have to have a lobby, and a professional group will go prepare papers for them, background information and all that, so that they understand what you want. And if you're able to do that, that means that they have served the job. So I think we need professional lobbying to make sure in the clutter they do pay attention to what is required.
But Dilip Cherian, the bigger question really, given the nature of polity in India, given the way policies are framed in this country, is it possible at all to go ahead with transparent lobbying? Is it possible at all to have a more clean system in place?
To legislate for lobbying is a bit like legislating what kind of knife that you can make and what its angle ought to be, without legislating that killing with a knife is illegal. So I think that this is a question of putting the cart before the horse. Unless there is far greater transparency within the bureaucratic system and the political system, RTI notwithstanding, we will always have a system where there will be suspicion as to how a policy was actually crafted. This is the real issue. So, as Mr. Pai just said, it's about professionals being able to untangle the information maze through which the policy maker has to navigate to create a policy which is even-handed and good for whosoever is pushing for it. But to my mind, this whole debate is, as it's seen in Parliament, is a bit underinformed. There isn't any difference between somebody lobbying that you should buy, for example, more naval frigates, or that you should spend more on education. Now, who decides what is good? Obviously, you're lobbying for something which you believe is good, and someone out there in the so-called policy maker has to decide, yes, this is good and this is what the country needs to do. But everybody's got to push for what they want to be heard. So whether it's a trade union, whether it's the Yadavs pushing for reservation, whether it's CII pushing for its viewpoint, or whether it's NASSCOM pushing in the US Congress for more visas, it's all about lobbying, because there's always another interest, and that interest may feel that in a transparent process you need to share the information.
That's an interesting point you make. NASSCOM pushing an agenda in the United States is absolutely fine, but NASSCOM doing perhaps the same thing here in the finance ministry will not be considered a good thing. But Mohandas Pai, just to come back to you, I mean, IT companies like Infosys, with which you've been associated for such a long while, have a very well-established caucus in the United States. How can those models perhaps be replicated in India?
Well, we can replicate it in India by making sure that, like I said, you register lobbying firms, you have professional lobbyists, you create a culture where there is transparency and people know what to do. The IT industry has hired lobbyists in Washington to get our views across, and I think doing that is extremely important because, like I said earlier, there's clutter among the legislators. There's too many things happening, and if you want to get your voice heard, you need to have the right people in place to get your voice heard. And lobbyists also make sure that you connect with the right kind of people so you can express yourself before them.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us right here in Business Tonight.